can take me," Daniel Reyes said, stepping forward before anyone else could speak. "But you leave her out of this." The room didn't react at first. Then the laughter came, low, amused, dangerous. They were standing in the back of a half-lit auto garage that smelled of oil and old rain, the kind of place where deals were made quietly and people disappeared even quieter. A dozen men leaned against concrete pillars and dented cars, watching with idle interest as if this were nothing more than another late-night transaction. At the center stood Marco Valente. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Power sat on him like a tailored coat, effortless, familiar. The faint scar along his jaw caught the fluorescent light when he tilted his head, studying Daniel the way one might study a cracked mirror. Not angry, curious. Behind Daniel, Sofia Morales froze. Her fingers were still clenched in the sleeve of his jacket, as if she hadn't yet realized he'd already stepped out of reach. Her eyes searched his back, wide with something that wasn't fear yet, but was close. Daniel didn't look at her. If he did, he wouldn't be able to stand there. He'd learned early in this city that survival meant staying small. Keep your head down. Pay what you owe. Don't ask questions. He worked long hours, took cash jobs no one wanted, and made himself forgettable on purpose. Invisible people didn't get noticed. Invisible people survived. But Sofia had never been invisible to him. Marco let the silence stretch. Men shifted their weight. Someone checked a watch. Somewhere deeper in the building, a machine clicked off, leaving the air thick and waiting. "So," Marco said at last, calm as still water, "you're offering yourself." Daniel nodded once. The debt had never been Sofia's. It was a name inherited, a number written years before she was old enough to understand what it meant. But debts didn't care about fairness. And Marco Valente didn't care about excuses. Victor Salgado smiled from the shadows. Daniel felt it then, the moment everything narrowed. The moment the world chose a direction and refused to turn back. Marco took one slow step forward. And that was when Daniel realized something terrifyingly simple. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about what love cost in a world built on fear. And whether he would survive the price. Daniel Reyes learned early how to make himself small. In a city that noticed everything it could exploit, being forgettable was a kind of armor. He walked with his shoulders slightly rounded, eyes forward but never challenging. He paid cash. He spoke only when necessary. He took the jobs other people avoided. Overnight loading docks, repair work in half-abandoned buildings, deliveries that ended just before dawn. Work that left no record except sore hands and quiet pay. Most people passed him without a second glance. That was the point. Daniel rented a narrow apartment above a closed tailor shop, the kind of place where the radiator hissed louder than the traffic outside and the walls remembered too many arguments. The windows faced an alley stained with oil and rainwater. It wasn't much, but it was safe enough. Safe was a relative word here. Safe meant unnoticed. Every morning, he woke before the sun, brewed cheap coffee, and stood by the window for a moment longer than necessary. Not dreaming. Just checking that the world was still there and hadn't decided to take something from him overnight. The only thing that ever made him linger was Sofia. She lived 3 blocks away, in an apartment that caught the light differently. Softer. Warmer. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the way she opened the curtains wide every morning, as if daring the city to look back at her. Or maybe it was simply her. Sofia Morales had a way of existing that Daniel never quite understood. She laughed easily. She spoke with her hands. She believed, stubbornly, that life could still turn out better than it had any right to. Daniel loved her for that. And feared for it. They met years ago in a corner cafe that no longer existed, when he spilled coffee and apologized 3 times before she could laugh it off. She remembered his name. That alone had startled him. Most people didn't bother. Their love grew quietly, without grand promises. Shared meals. Long walks taken the long way home to avoid certain streets. Conversations whispered late at night when the city sounded almost gentle. Daniel never talked much about his past. Sofia never pushed. Some things she understood were carried silently. But silence didn't mean absence of fear. Daniel noticed things. The way certain cars slowed near Sophia's block. The unfamiliar faces that appeared, then disappeared. The envelope that came once, slipped under her door without a stamp. She hadn't opened it in front of him, but he'd seen her hands shake afterward. He told himself it was nothing. That worrying was a habit, not a warning. Still he adjusted. He walked her home more often. He took routes that kept them visible, lit. He stayed small, but he stayed close. At night, when Sophia slept beside him, breathing steady, Daniel lay awake listening to the building settle. He counted sounds. Sirens far away. Footsteps too close. His mind ran through quiet calculations he never shared. If something happened, how fast could he move? Who would he call? What would he give? He already knew the answer to the last one. Daniel didn't see himself as brave. He didn't imagine himself strong. He had never wanted to be a hero. Heroes attracted attention. Heroes were remembered. Heroes didn't survive long in this city. But love was a dangerous thing. Love made you visible. And though Daniel Reyes had spent his life learning how to disappear, there was one truth he could no longer avoid. If the city ever came for Sophia, staying small would not be enough. The first sign came quietly, the way most real threats did. Sophia found the envelope when she came home from work, slid halfway under her door as if it had always belonged there. No stamp. No return address. Just thick paper, heavier than it needed to be. She didn't open it right away. She stood in the narrow hallway listening to the building breathe, then tucked it into her bag and walked the 3 blocks to Daniel's place without looking back. They opened it together at his small kitchen table. Inside was a single sheet and a number written in dark ink. No explanation. No signature. Just an amount so large it didn't feel real, followed by an address and a time. Daniel stared at it longer than he should have. He recognized the format. Everyone did, even if they pretended not to. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a mistake. It was a reminder. "This isn't mine," Sophia said quietly, as if saying it softly might make it true. "I never. My father cleared everything before he died. I checked." Daniel nodded. He believed her. He also knew belief didn't matter. Debts in this city didn't follow logic. They followed names. Old favors. Old grudges. They survived the people who made them and attached themselves to the ones left behind. You could live your whole life clean and still inherit someone else's sin. They went to the address because not going was worse. The place wasn't marked. Just a shuttered office wedged between a pawn shop and a liquor store, its windows blacked out. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and something metallic. Men stood along the walls, relaxed in the way only dangerous people ever were. And then there was Marco Valente. He sat at a desk that didn't match the room, sleeves rolled up, hands folded as if he'd been expecting them. He looked ordinary at first glance, well-dressed, calm, almost polite. But the stillness around him was wrong. It bent the space subtly, pulling attention whether you wanted to give it or not. Marco looked at Sophia first. Not with hunger. Not with anger. With assessment. Then he looked at Daniel. "Sit," Marco said, not raising his voice. They did. Marco spoke as if he were explaining a simple misunderstanding. The debt wasn't Sophia's doing, he admitted. It had been attached to her family years ago, rerouted, forgotten, then remembered again when someone decided it was useful. The amount had grown. Interest was a patient thing. "We don't have that kind of money," Sophia said. Her voice stayed steady, but Daniel felt the tension in her hand against his knee. Marco smiled faintly. "That's usually the case." Victor Salgado shifted behind them, his presence sharp and deliberate. Daniel didn't turn, but he felt him there, like a blade left on a table within reach. Marco leaned back slightly. "I'm not unreasonable," he said. "Debts can be adjusted, settled in other ways." Daniel understood then. Not fully. Not yet. But enough. Sophia shook her head. I won't be used to pay for something I didn't do. Marco's gaze softened, almost sympathetic. That's admirable. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Daniel felt it press against his ribs. He thought of the envelope, of the streets that suddenly felt narrower, of the way Sophia still believed the world could be fair. He stood before fear could stop him. You can take me, Daniel said, his voice low but clear. But you leave her out of this. Marco studied him for a long moment. And in that moment Daniel's quiet life, every careful choice, every invisible step, came to an end. The room reacted slowly, as if the words needed time to be understood. Victor Salgado laughed first. Not loud. Just a short breath of sound through his nose, amused and sharp. One of the men by the wall straightened, interest flickering across his face. Even Marco Valente's fingers paused where they rested on the desk. Sophia stood up so abruptly her chair scraped the floor. No, she said, turning to Daniel, her voice breaking through the stillness. Daniel, don't. This isn't. He didn't look at her. If he did, he would falter. He kept his eyes on Marco instead, steadying his breath the way he always did when fear crept in. Controlled. I said take me, Daniel repeated. Whatever the debt is attached to, put it on my name. End it with me. Marco leaned back fully now, studying Daniel as if seeing him for the first time. Not dismissive. Curious. The way someone looks at a piece that doesn't quite fit the board but might still be useful. You know what you're offering? Marco asked. Daniel nodded once. Yes. That kind of certainty usually comes from men who think they have nothing to lose, Marco said lightly. Or men who are lying to themselves. Sophia reached for Daniel's arm. He felt her fingers tremble. Please, she whispered. We'll figure something out. We always do. He finally turned to her then. Just for a second. Her eyes were bright with fear and disbelief, and something deeper, hurt. The idea that he would step out of her life like this, that he would decide alone, terrified her more than Marco ever could. I need you safe, Daniel said quietly. That's all. Victor took a step closer. You're volunteering to be collateral, he said, as if tasting the words. That's rare. Marco raised a hand and Victor stopped. The silence stretched again, thick and deliberate. Marco stood and walked around the desk, slow and unhurried. When he stopped in front of Daniel, he was close enough that Daniel could smell the faint trace of cologne beneath the smoke. People offer themselves all the time, Marco said. They just don't mean it. Daniel didn't move. Marco smiled faintly. You do. Sophia shook her head, tears spilling now. This isn't love, she said to Marco, anger breaking through fear. It's cruelty. Marco looked at her, almost gently. Love is exactly what makes this possible. He turned back to Daniel. If I accept, he continued, there's no undoing it. No negotiations later. No appeals. I understand, Daniel said. Marco glanced at Victor. Check him. Victor stepped forward and searched Daniel quickly. Rough hands efficient. When he finished, he nodded. Marco exhaled slowly, as if settling a thought. Very well, he said. The debt ends with you. Sophia let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob. She grabbed Daniel's jacket, clutching it as if she could anchor him there by force alone. No, she said again, softer now. Daniel, please. He leaned down and pressed his forehead briefly to hers. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. Her warmth. Her breath. The life he wanted for her. I'll be okay, he lied gently. Victor took Daniel by the arm. Marco watched them, expression unreadable. Make it clean, he said. I don't want noise. As Victor pulled him toward the door, Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not fear exactly, but clarity. The quiet life was gone. The smallness, the invisibility. He had stepped forward and there was no stepping back. The door closed behind him. And for the first time, Daniel Reyes understood what it meant to be seen. They didn't let Daniel say goodbye properly. Victor's grip tightened the moment they stepped outside, the night air colder than it had any right to be. The door shut behind them with a dull finality, sealing Sophia on the other side. Daniel heard her voice once, his name sharp with panic, before the sound was swallowed by concrete and distance. The garage lights flickered as they moved him through a back corridor. No ceremony, no threat, just motion. He focused on the rhythm of his steps, the scrape of boots on oil-stained floor, the steady pressure at his elbow. Small, controlled. Breathe in, breathe out. A black SUV waited at the curb. The door opened. Daniel was pushed inside. The city slid past the tinted windows in broken reflections. Streetlights, closed storefronts, a couple arguing on a corner. Ordinary lives moving on without noticing the quiet transaction that had just taken place. He wondered briefly if this was how it always happened. If people vanished not with chaos, but with a gentle efficiency that left no ripple. They didn't speak to him during the drive. Victor sat up front checking his phone. The engine hummed. Time stretched thin and strange. Daniel thought of Sophia's hands, still warm on his sleeve. Of the way she looked at him like he was something solid in a world that shifted too easily. He held that image carefully, the way one might carry a fragile thing across uneven ground. When the SUV stopped, he felt it in his bones before he saw it, the weight of the place. An abandoned warehouse crouched at the edge of the river, windows dark, walls scarred by old graffiti and newer warnings. Inside, the air was damp and metallic. The lights were harsh, unforgiving. They sat him in a chair. His wrists were tied, not painfully, just tight enough to remind him of the limits. The room smelled of concrete and rust. Somewhere, water dripped steadily, marking time he no longer controlled. Victor leaned in, close enough that Daniel could feel his breath. "This is where you wait," he said. "Whether you're worth what you offered." Daniel lifted his head. "She's free." Victor smiled thinly. "For now." The door closed again, leaving Daniel alone with the sound of his own breathing. Across the city, Sophia stood in the narrow hallway of Daniel's apartment, the door shut, the silence roaring. She pressed her back to the wall and slid down until she was sitting on the floor, knees pulled to her chest. Her phone lay useless in her hand. Every number she could think of felt too small, too slow. Safe, they had said. Safe felt like a word without meaning. She replayed the moment over and over. The way Daniel didn't look back, the way he said her name like a promise and an apology all at once. She hated him for that. Loved him for it. Fear twisted tight in her chest, sharp and relentless. Outside, sirens wailed and faded. Life continued. The city did not pause for love. Back in the warehouse, Daniel closed his eyes and let the fear come. He didn't fight it. Fighting wasted energy. He counted his breaths. He counted the seconds between drips. He stayed present. This was the price. This was what it meant when love became collateral. And as the hours began to stretch, thin and merciless, Daniel Reyes held on to one truth with everything he had left. As long as Sophia was safe, he would endure whatever came next. Time lost its shape in the warehouse. Daniel wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting when Victor Salgado returned. There was no warning, just the sound of footsteps and the door opening with a flat, indifferent creak. Light spilled in, sharp and unforgiving, cutting across the floor and settling on Daniel's face. Victor studied him for a moment, hands in his pockets, expression bored. "Still upright," he said. "That's something." Daniel lifted his head slowly. His muscles ached from holding tension too long, from staying ready with nowhere to run. He didn't answer. Words felt like a resource better saved. Victor circled him, footsteps measured. "You know," he continued, "most people start begging by now. Or bargaining. Or lying. They promise money they don't have. Names they don't know." He stopped in front of Daniel. "You've done none of that." Daniel met his eyes. Not defiant. Not pleading. Just present. Victor smiled faintly. "That makes this harder." The first blow came without ceremony. Not sudden enough to shock. Not brutal enough to end anything quickly. Just precise. Victor wasn't angry. He was thorough. Each strike carried a message Daniel understood all too well. This was what debts felt like when they collected interest. Daniel focused inward. He counted breaths again. He remembered the feel of Sophia's apartment in the mornings. Sunlight spilling across the floor she never bothered to cover. He remembered her laugh, the way it surprised her as much as anyone else. Pain came in waves. He let it pass through him without resistance, the way you let cold water numb instead of fighting it. He didn't cry out. He didn't curse. Silence was another kind of armor. Victor paused eventually, stepping back as if evaluating his work. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. Daniel swallowed. His throat felt raw. "Neither are you." Victor chuckled softly. "Careful." Hours blurred. Sometimes Victor left. Sometimes others came in and left again, their presence heavy but restrained. They never rushed. There was no need. Time did the work for them. At one point, Victor crouched in front of him. "You know what this is really about, don't you?" he asked quietly. "It's not the money. It's the lesson." Daniel's vision swam, but he nodded. "You want people to see." "Exactly," Victor said. "You offered yourself so publicly. That kind of thing can't go unanswered. Makes others think they can do the same." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "They can't." Victor stood. "Good. Then we understand each other." When the door finally shut again, Daniel sagged forward, held upright only by the ropes that cut into his wrists. His body trembled, not from fear but exhaustion. Every part of him hurt in small, insistent ways. Still, somewhere beneath it all, something stubborn remained. He thought of Sophia, safe but awake somewhere across the city, likely pacing, likely blaming herself. The thought steadied him. If he broke, if he gave Victor the satisfaction of begging, it would all be for nothing. Debt had teeth. He could feel every one of them. But Daniel Reyes stayed silent. And in that silence, he refused to let the city take anything more than his body. The clock Daniel couldn't see kept moving anyway. Somewhere beyond the warehouse walls, the night loosened its grip and edged toward morning. Inside, the light never changed. Daniel measured time by the ache in his limbs, by the way his thoughts came slower now, heavier. Every breath took effort. Every blink felt like a decision. When the door opened again, it wasn't Victor. Two men came in quietly, checked his restraints, checked his pulse, exchanged a look. One of them nodded once. Satisfied. They left without a word. Daniel understood the message. He was still useful. Barely. Across the city, Sophia had stopped pacing. Panic burned energy too fast, and she needed every ounce she had left. She sat at Daniel's kitchen table, phone pressed to her ear, listening to it ring and ring. Every unanswered call tightened something in her chest. She replayed Marco's calm voice. The way he'd said adjusted. The way Victor had smiled like none of this was personal. She wiped her face and stood. If Daniel had taught her anything, it was that staying still never saved you. Luis Herrera answered on the third ring. She hadn't wanted to call him. Luis lived close enough to Marco's orbit that knowing him came with risks. He was the kind of man who'd seen enough to recognize danger before it announced itself. He and Daniel weren't close, but there was a mutual understanding, quiet respect built on shared caution. "Sophia," Luis said slowly, "you shouldn't be calling me." "I know," she replied. "But they took him." Silence stretched on the line, heavier than before. "Who?" "You know who." Luis exhaled. "Where?" "I don't know. I don't even know if he's—" She stopped herself. Saying it out loud felt like an invitation for it to become true. "He offered himself. For me." Another pause. Then softer. "That sounds like Daniel." "I need time," she said. "I need leverage. Or weigh in. Or something. Anything." Luis didn't answer immediately. Sophia pictured him standing by his window, weighing the cost. Everyone did, eventually. That was the currency of this city. How much you were willing to lose. I can ask questions, he said finally. Quiet ones. But Sophia, you need to understand something. I do, she said. I understand everything. No, Luis replied. You understand fear. That's not the same. She closed her eyes. Please, Luis sighed. I'll see what I can find. But clocks like this don't stop. If Marco wanted him dead, he'd already be gone. That means something else is happening. What? Pressure, Luis said. Messages. This is about making a point. Sophia's hands clenched into fists. He won't break. I know, Luis said. That's what scares me. Back in the warehouse, Victor returned alone. He stood just inside the door, watching Daniel with an unreadable expression. Time's tightening, Victor said casually. Boss doesn't like waiting. Daniel forced his eyes open. His vision blurred, but Victor's shape held steady enough. He said she was free, Daniel murmured. Victor tilted his head. For now. Something flickered behind his eyes then. Not pity, not regret. Calculation. You've got people asking questions, Victor continued. That's inconvenient. Daniel managed a shallow breath. That means she's trying. Victor stepped closer. It means your clock is almost done. When the door shut again, Daniel sagged forward, heart pounding unevenly. The air felt thin. His thoughts drifted dangerously. He pictured Sophia's face, not as she'd been when they dragged him away, but laughing, alive, stubbornly hopeful. He held on to that image like a lifeline. Somewhere in the city, wheels were turning. Lines were being crossed. Time was running out. And Daniel Reyes stayed conscious not because he was strong, but because love refused to let him go. Daniel's body began to betray him in small, humiliating ways. His hands shook even when he was still. His vision narrowed at the edges, dark bleeding into light. Breathing no longer came automatically. It had to be chosen, pulled in deliberately like water from a well that was running dry. The ropes bit into his wrists, not sharp enough to draw blood, just constant, an ache that reminded him he was still there. Victor returned more often now. He didn't rush. He never did. He spoke softly, as if patience itself were a weapon. Each visit was a test, not just of endurance but of will. You can stop this, Victor said at one point, crouching in front of him. All you have to do is admit it wasn't worth it. Daniel lifted his head with effort. His lips were cracked. His voice came rough, barely more than air. She is. Victor studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. You really believe that? Daniel didn't answer right away. He felt the room tilt, the edges of the world sliding. He focused on Victor's face to steady himself. I don't need to believe it, Daniel said finally. I know it. Victor straightened, irritation flickering through his calm. You're not brave, he said. You're just stubborn. Daniel's mouth curved faintly. Might have been a smile. Same thing, he whispered. After that, Victor stopped trying to reason with him. Time fractured. Daniel drifted in and out of awareness, carried on memories when his body could no longer carry itself. He remembered Sophia sitting on the edge of his bed, pulling on her boots, complaining about the cold even in summer. He remembered her humming when she cooked, off-key and unapologetic. He remembered the way she said his name when she was tired, soft, unguarded. Those memories hurt more than anything else. But they also held him together. When the pain came, he didn't fight it. Fighting meant panic, and panic burned through strength too quickly. Instead, he let it wash over him, dull and heavy like rain soaking into concrete. He told himself this was temporary, that his body was failing, but his choice wasn't. At some point, Victor leaned close again. You're fading, he said quietly. Boss doesn't like broken goods. Daniel forced his eyes open. Then finish it. Victor watched him for a long moment. Something unreadable passed through his expression. You really would die for her. Daniel swallowed. His throat burned. I already am. Victor stepped back. Hours later, or minutes, Daniel couldn't tell. He felt himself slipping further, consciousness thinning like fog. The room seemed farther away. Sounds dulled. His heartbeat felt uneven, distant. In that haze, something shifted inside him. He realized he wasn't holding on because he wanted to live. He was holding on because letting go would mean the city had won. It would mean fear had proven stronger than love. It would mean Sophia's safety had been bought with his surrender instead of his resolve. And that, Daniel knew, was unacceptable. So when his body shook and his vision darkened, he stayed present anyway. When the pain begged him to speak, to bargain, to beg, he stayed silent. When exhaustion whispered that no one would blame him if he stopped, he refused. Daniel Reyes had been small his whole life. But here, in this narrow space between endurance and collapse, he became something else entirely. Not a hero. Not a martyr. Shield. And even as his body failed him, the thing that mattered most did not break. The decision was made long before anyone spoke it out loud. Marco Valente stood by the window of his office. The city stretched beneath him in pale morning light. Traffic moved like veins opening for the day. Ordinary people going to ordinary lives. He watched it all with the detached calm of someone who had shaped outcomes for too long to believe in coincidence. Victor stood a few feet behind him, silent. He's still alive, Victor said finally. Not a report. Question wrapped in fact. Marco nodded once. Barely. Victor hesitated. He hasn't asked for anything. Marco turned slowly. That caught his attention. No names. Marco asked. No bargaining. No apologies. Victor shook his head. He just endures. Marco studied him. Victor Salgado did not unsettle easily. The faint tension in his posture spoke louder than words. People like that become problems, Marco said calmly. Not because they fight back. Because they don't. Victor frowned. What do you want done? Marco didn't answer immediately. He walked back to his desk and sat, fingers steepled, eyes distant. He thought of the questions starting to ripple outward. Quiet ones. Careful ones. The kind that didn't panic but didn't stop either. He thought of Sophia Morales. How she had looked at him without begging. How she had said no as if the words still carried weight. Most of all, he thought of Daniel Reyes. A man who had stepped forward without bravado. Who hadn't shouted or threatened. Who had simply placed himself between danger and the person he loved and refused to move. Bring him up, Marco said at last. Victor stiffened slightly. He's in bad shape. Marco's gaze hardened. I didn't say gently. The warehouse felt smaller when Marco entered it. Not because it changed but because power did. The men straightened instinctively. The air shifted. Daniel barely registered the footsteps at first. His head hung forward, chin near his chest. His breathing was shallow, uneven. When Marco stopped in front of him, it took effort, visible painful effort, for Daniel to lift his eyes. For a moment neither spoke. Marco studied him closely now. The bruises. The dried blood at the corner of his mouth. The way he still held himself upright despite everything working against him. This is what you wanted? Marco asked quietly. Daniel swallowed. His voice came hoarse but steady. She's safe. Marco nodded. She is. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Relief crossed his face so openly it almost startled Marco. That was the deal, Daniel murmured. Yes, Marco said. It was. He circled once, slow, deliberate. You've made your point. Daniel didn't respond. He was too tired to pretend strength now. You understand what happens next, Marco continued. People will hear about this. They'll learn that stepping forward has consequences. Daniel forced his focus back. They'll learn, it's possible. Marco stopped. The silence that followed was sharp. Victor watched closely, unsure now which way the balance would fall. Marco exhaled slowly. Control had always been his currency. Fear his language. But something about this, about a man who refused to break even when breaking would have been easier, threatened the order he maintained. Power could crush, or it could choose restraint. Marco stepped closer and crouched slightly, bringing himself level with Daniel's gaze. "You walk away," Marco said. "The debt ends. Permanently." Victor's head snapped up. Daniel's brow furrowed faintly, confusion cutting through the haze. "Why?" Marco held his gaze. "Because I don't need corpses to prove authority. And because shields like you don't come around often." He stood. "Take him to the hospital," Marco ordered. Quietly. Victor hesitated. "And the message?" Marco's eyes hardened. "The message is this. I decide when mercy is expensive." As they moved Daniel, his consciousness wavered, but he caught one last thing. Marco Valente turning back to the window, alone again with the city. Power remained, but it had shifted. And Daniel Reyes, carried out between strangers, had changed it, without ever raising a hand. Daniel woke to the sound of machines he didn't recognize and a light that felt too clean to belong to him. For a moment he didn't know where he was. His body felt distant, stitched together by ache and exhaustion. When he tried to move, pain answered first, sharp and immediate, then settled into something deeper, a reminder rather than a warning. He breathed anyway. That was how he knew he was still alive. The room smelled of antiseptic and early morning. Pale curtains filtered the sun into thin lines across the floor. Somewhere nearby, a monitor kept a steady rhythm, indifferent to the cost it had taken to keep it going. Sophia was asleep in the chair beside the bed. Her head rested against the mattress, fingers wrapped loosely around his hand as if she'd been afraid to let go even while she slept. There were dark circles beneath her eyes, her face drawn with exhaustion and relief tangled together. Daniel watched her quietly. He tried to speak, but his throat refused. Instead, his fingers shifted slightly in her grasp. The movement was small. It was enough. Sophia startled awake, eyes flying open. When she saw him watching her, she froze, as if afraid the moment might shatter if she moved too quickly. Then she leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently to his hand, breath catching. "You're here," she whispered. "You stayed." Daniel swallowed. His voice came out rough, barely sound. "You, okay." A laugh escaped her, shaky and wet. "You almost died," she said. "And you're asking about me." He managed the faintest smile. "Habit." She laughed again, then cried, then did both at once. Daniel felt it all settle over him. The weight of what had happened, the cost that still lingered in every inch of his body. He felt weaker than he ever had. And strangely clearer. Later, when a doctor came and went, when the room fell quiet again, Daniel stared at the ceiling and let the truth settle. He would heal. Slowly. There would be scars that didn't show, and some that would. Nights when sleep came hard. Sounds that made his chest tighten. He wouldn't be the man who stayed small anymore. Not because he wanted attention, but because the city had already seen him. That kind of visibility never faded completely. Across town, Marco Valente stood at his window again, the city moving beneath him. The debt was erased. The message had been sent. Control remained, but it had been tested, and that mattered more than he liked. Power always cost something. Back in the hospital room, Sophia shifted closer, careful not to disturb the lines and wires. Daniel turned his head toward her, every movement deliberate. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She shook her head immediately. "Don't." "I didn't ask you," he said. "I decided for you. You chose us," she replied. "And I hate that it almost killed you. But I won't pretend it didn't matter." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Nothing's the same now." "No," Sophia agreed. "But we're still here." That was the part that mattered. Daniel Reyes had lived. Love had survived. But survival wasn't free. It left marks. Demanded honesty. It changed the shape of who you were allowed to be afterward. And as the city carried on beyond the hospital walls, Daniel understood something with a clarity he'd never had before. Being a shield didn't mean you walked away unbroken. It meant you lived knowing exactly what it had cost, and choosing every day after to carry it anyway.